Part 2. As for Staples, he is also thought to be uneducated and has been accused multiple times of not belonging to the spaces he is in. Staples has multiple memories in which people made assumptions about him that could have led to dangerous outcomes. He recalls the time at his job, the office manager called security, and with an ADHOC posse pursued me through the labyrinth halls, nearly to my editor's door. I had no way of proving who I was. I could only move briskly toward the company of someone who knew me. As a black journalist in Chicago in the late 1970s and early 1980s, an office manager called security on him because they thought he was a burglar because he was rushing and in a hurry. Yet had he been a white man running with some papers in his hand, they would have not called security on him or chased him all the way through the halls. They would have asked him who he was if they had not recognized him, but instead, just because he was a black man, they assumed he had the intent of stealing something, so they called security on them. Fucked up. The action of which could have put him in danger. He was lucky that he had someone he knew in that office, otherwise he could have been arrested or shot, or worse, killed, which is not an uncommon thing to happen to black men or just black people in general. As for their second differences, they are victims of different gender and racist stereotypes, Staples being the predator of women and Kofor being an easy prey for men. Judith Kofor has been harassed multiple times by people. They would make assumptions about Kofor culturally due to the stereotypes they had heard in the media. For example, calling women spicy, assuming that they are inherently more sexual beings, which often puts them in dangerous and unpleasant situations. One of the earliest examples of this was at her first formal dance, where her date kissed her without consent. And this is what she said. When I didn't respond with sufficient passion, he remarked resentfully, I thought you Latina girls were supposed to mature early, as if I was expected to ripen like a fruit or vegetable, not just grow into womanhood like other girls. This kind of thinking leads to Latinas being more likely to be abused or taken advantage by creepy men. And if you consider the fact that there are language barriers for a lot of Latinas and Hispanic women who have not learned English, the percentage of such harm rises. As for Brent Staples, he deals with the opposite, being perceived as the predator instead of as a prey. The idea of being seen as a threat is never comforting, and as a young man of only 22, a self-described softie, to be aware of how both women and other people see him, especially at night, is incredibly isolating. He tells us of a story of a white woman who was well-dressed in her 20s that ran away from him one night as he was taking a nighttime stroll to escape his insomnia. That event haunts him, he says. It was the echoes of that terrified woman's footsteps that I first began to know the unwielding inheritance I had come into, the ability to alter public spaces in such ugly ways. It also made it clear that I was indistinguishable from the muggers who occasionally seeped into the area from the surrounding ghetto. This incident would not be the last encounter of someone being afraid of him. As he typically walked at night, he would see their hunched-over figures as they moved quickly, not to get attacked, their belongings held tightly to their chest, and there is not much he can do about it. Because based on his appearance, the fact that he is 6 foot tall, and the fact that he is a black man, he is perceived as a threat, which is racist. But the problem of racism and prejudice that he faces is nowhere near ending or being resolved. All he can do is try his best to not get killed in a racist society that should be the one to change. Kofor and Staples' shared experiences and stories about dealing with racism and sexism is delivered in a very realistic manner. As a result, the tone of both of them are obviously realistic. In Kofor's essay, she discusses the types of discrimination and stereotypes she and other women face as Latinas. Kofor says, I recall hearing about the harassment that Puerto Rican women endure in factories where boss men talked to them as if sexual innuendo were all they understood, and worse, often gave them the choice of submitting to their advances or getting fired. By the end of the essay, while the discrimination she and other Latinas go through is still ongoing, she tells us that it is her hope that by sharing her story, she will be able to replace the harmful stereotypes with the realities of actual Latinas. She hopes that with all the stories that she tells and writes, the dreams and fears she shares, that one day her audience will look past her skin color, her accent, and what she wears. The last thing Kofor tells us is of a poem she wrote about Latina women who were hoping that their God was bilingual, and it was a prayer for communication and respect. The content of Staples' essay was also very realistic as he discusses the very real discrimination and predatory stereotypes that follow black men. He described the ongoing hardships he faces dealing with the public as a black man in the United States. At the age of 22, he became aware of the fact that people saw him as dangerous, and he became accustomed to people who would rather cross the street than pass him, which is something he will never be comfortable about. He talks about the fact that black men have a firm place in New York mugging literature, mostly written by racist writers, but he acknowledges that women are vulnerable to street violence. But the truth is that most young black men are drastically overrepresented among the perpetrators of such violence. However, that truth does not bring any solace against the kind of alienation that comes from always being a suspect that people see as a fearsome entity that people refuse to make eye contact with. And in his essay, he says, "And soon I gathered that being perceived as dangerous is a hazard in itself, where fear and weapons meet, and they often do in urban America. There is always the possibility of death." At the end of his essay, he remained a night walker. But he employs what he considers to be an excellent tension-reducing measure, whistling melodies from Beethoven and Vivaldi. He does this as a protective measure for him so the pedestrians would not see him as a threat and relax at night. It was his equivalent to a cowbell, and he does it because all it would take was one wrong turn, one trigger-happy group of scared people, and he could be killed despite having done nothing wrong, or rather, done nothing but walk down the street. In the end of both essays, both of them are still educated writers who deal with racist